Hello, Google and guests. Welcome to Talks at Google. My name is Lindsay Compton, and I work on publisher partnerships here at Google. And I'm a proud member of our employee resource group, VetNet. I'm so excited to host today's discussion with two very distinguished guests, retired U.S. Navy Captain Joellen Drag Oslund and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Beverly Weintraub. Joellen was the first U.S. Navy female helicopter pilot, first woman assigned to duty aboard a U.S. Navy ship, and first female combat search and rescue helicopter aircraft commander, among many other accolades. Her most impactful accomplishment, in my opinion, was her successful challenge, in partnership with many other military female trailblazers, a federal law that excluded women from serving on U.S. Navy ships. As a female veteran myself who spent the majority of my career on ships or deployed abroad, I'm acutely aware of the impact Joellen has had on my entire professional career and the course she continues to chart for all women in the military. Beverly Weintraub is the executive editor at The 74 Media, has written for multiple prestigious publications, and in December made her author debut with the book Wings of Gold, the story of the first women naval aviators. Ladies, thank you for all your amazing work over your respective careers. Thank you for paving the way for women like me, and thank you for sharing your time and experiences with Google. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for your introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to present to Talks at Google today as part of your Women's History Month program. It's an honor to be speaking to you and to tell you the story of my fight to fly at sea. I'm also very pleased that Beverly will be joining us at the end of my presentation. I'd like to start my presentation with a short video.
In January 1973, 8 female trainees were selected to train as United States Naval Aviators. 4 months later, the women reported to Pensacola, Florida for flight training. 6 of the original 8 women went on to earn their Wings of Gold and became the first women to be designated full-fledged military pilots. The first class of women naval aviators includes Judith Newfer, Barbara Allen, Jane Skiles, Anna Marie Scott, Joellen Drag, and Rosemary Mirams. These dedicated women became fully integrated into their squadrons, eventually commanding some of these units. While there were difficult circumstances along the way, these 6 women persevered and made lasting contributions. Their success made it possible for subsequent female naval aviators. These 6 pioneers clearly demonstrated that women had the physical and mental capacity to fly not just naval aircraft, but perform all military missions. Their success set an example for the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, and U.S. Coast Guard to emulate. These services subsequently opened pilot training to women, forever changing the face of military aviation. Their courage and determination in the air, at sea, and on the ground paved the way for all future female military aviators by constantly being first women in opening new aircraft types and missions. Some 19 years later, the opportunity for women to fly all types of aircraft in the military inventory became a reality. Standing on the shoulders of the WASP, their successes proved the ability of women to fly and serve their country anytime, anywhere.
That video played at the induction of the first class of 6 women naval aviators into the Women in Aviation International Pioneer Hall of Fame in Orlando in March of 2017. I'd like to dedicate my talk today to Captain Rosemary Mariner, U.S. Navy retired. Rosemary passed away in January of 2019 after a hard-fought 5-year battle with ovarian cancer. Rosie and I met in officer candidate school, where we were commissioned as ensigns, and we completed the first part of our naval training together. She was my dear friend for more than 46 years. Rosie was the first woman to fly a tactical jet in the U.S. military, and her impact on the Navy and women military pilots is immeasurable and extends to every woman aviator in all service branches today. My husband and I joined her husband Tommy and Rosemary's family and dozens of other military women at her aviators at her funeral outside Knoxville, where for the first time in Navy history, a formation of 4 Navy F-18 Super Hornets, all launched and flown by Navy women pilots and ground crew, conducted a flyover and the missing woman maneuver. That flyover represented the culmination of everything the first 6 of us, and Rosemary in particular, had fought for. Rosie is irreplaceable, and her guidance and leadership are greatly missed as we continue to work for women's equality in the military. And this is a photo of the combat qualified and experienced pilots who flew that flyover formation. We were able to meet them later that evening, and I was so impressed by their professionalism, their dedication to our country, and their appreciation of history. My story begins in November of 1972. I was a 22-year-old college student due to graduate in 1 month with a bachelor's in political science, and not at all sure what to do with my future. The early 70s were a very exciting time for women, and a lot of barriers were coming down. The Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, looked like it would pass. Women were beginning to make advances in education and the workforce, thanks to Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited employment discrimination, quote, because of sex, a phrase that was added almost as a joke to that historic legislation. Another important but little appreciated event at the time was the passage of Title IX, a comprehensive federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any federally funded education program or activity, including sports. It opened the way for women's competitive sports programs in the US. In addition, the Vietnam War was nearly over, and the military draft was scheduled to end in 1973. The popular message of the 70s was that women could do anything, but the reality was quite different. It was still difficult to break into non-traditional jobs, and the promise of women's equality hadn't really reached the mainstream, and it particularly hadn't reached men. Women's lib was in its infancy. And this Young Miss magazine cover illustrates the mixed messages of the times. You can be a Navy pilot, but wouldn't you rather really be a cheerleader? And the article about me was near the end, right after the cookie recipes. To understand the opportunities of the 70s, we need to go back to the 1940s and World War II, which had many parallels for women in the United States. The military faced a shortage of manpower, and women were needed for many jobs that had previously been considered almost unthinkable, including military service. You may be familiar with the Rosie the Riveter posters of women who served the war as civilians. Many other women joined the military, including my own mother, who served in the U.S. Marine Corps. And here she is with my father in Washington, D.C. in 1947. But there was another group of women who filled far more dangerous and daring jobs during World War II, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs as they were known. From 1942 to 1944, there were 1,074 WASPs who qualified to fly military aircraft. They were trained to fly and transport every plane that the military flew at that time, and 38 of them gave their lives fulfilling that mission. But because they were not considered to be military members under the guidelines at the time, a fallen WASP had to be buried at family expense without traditional military honors or even an official letter acknowledging her sacrifice. The Army would not even allow the U.S. flag to be placed on the coffin. In December of 1944, the remaining WASPs were all sent home with a verbal thank you. They had no military veteran status, no benefits, and even had to pay their own way to get back home. With their disbandment, a brave new chapter in women's equality abruptly ended. Fast forward 30 years to the early 70s, and the military services were again facing many of the same manpower shortages as they had in World War II. For the Navy and its Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, the answer to those manpower shortages once again was women. Admiral Zumwalt was a very forward-thinking CNO, and he did not like waiting around for studies and committees or congressional action. He was well known for sending out major policy changes in the form of Chief of Naval Operations messages. They were nicknamed Z-grams. With the ERA all but certain to pass, or so it appeared at that time, the impending end of the military draft and the imminent requirement for an all-volunteer military force, Admiral Zumwalt composed Z-gram 116, Equal Rights and Opportunities for Women, in August of 1972. It was a huge step forward for women in the military and the Navy, both officer and enlisted, and it opened up many ratings and specialties to women that had previously been denied to them. But it wasn't until November of 72 that Admiral Zumwalt issued a follow-up message and opened Navy flight training to women for a trial program. And it was this message that a friend placed in my hands in early November of 1972 and said, "You should go for this." People often ask me, whatever made you think you could do it? And I'll be honest, to some extent, I just really didn't realize what I was getting into. My childhood as a Navy brat definitely prepared me in many ways, as did my parents, especially my mother, who always encouraged my sisters and brother and I never to be afraid and to try anything. One of my father's duty stations was a little-known naval station in the Philippines called Sangley Point. As children, we got to do a lot of things that many kids only dreamed about: swimming and snorkeling in the nearby bay and ocean, whitewater rafting, and rest and relaxation trips around the Philippines. Later on, in high school and college, training and jumping horses became my passion. Loading hay and shoveling horse manure would later serve me very well in the Navy on so many levels. And it was those experiences that gave me my confidence. With Z-gram in hand, I went down to the local Navy recruiter, who had not yet seen the message and didn't even believe that it was legitimate. When I returned the next day, my reception was far more welcoming. After passing the written flight aptitude exam and doing a round of recruiting publicity photos, I was off to Women Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, in mid-January of 1973. I used to be a little embarrassed by this photo that appeared on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, but mini skirts and go-go boots were really in back then, and so now I've decided to own it. I proudly took the oath of enlistment administered by my father, a retired commander who served 30 years in the Navy. My women officer class was the last one to be gender segregated, yet another sign that steps were being taken to equalize opportunities for women in the Navy. And it was in Women Officer School that I met 4 of the other women who had been selected for pilot training. As the CNO's message had directed, of the 8 women who were selected, 4 were recruited from civilian life, like myself, and 4 were women on active duty or already in Women Officer School. Coincidentally, this photo from Women Officer School is taken next to an H-3 helicopter, which was the last model that I flew in the Navy. 2 of the aviation candidates eventually dropped out, and that left 6 of us to complete pilot training. After receiving my commission as an ensign in May of 1973, I was off to Pensacola for naval flight training. It was a great relief to meet the other women, but because of class schedules and company assignments, we didn't really get to spend a lot of time together. In fact, after aviation ground school in Pensacola, Florida, we almost never saw each other again. Essentially, we all went through our flight training alone. This photo shows Jane Skiles O'Day, Barbara Allen Rainey, Judith Newfer Bruner, and myself, the first 4 women to complete Navy flight training. Since Admiral Zumwalt had opened naval aviation to women by decree and declared it a trial program, not much thought had been given to details like flight gear that would fit us, appropriate uniforms for physical training — we only had uniforms with skirts and heels — and whether the physical fitness standards were to be adjusted or to remain the same as they were for the men. We were the guinea pigs, and we quickly found out that the Navy was very concerned and by that I mean completely obsessed, with our supposed lack of physical strength, and particularly our upper body strength. You may not realize that women's sports programs in high school and college were virtually non-existent in the 60s and 70s. Women were just not expected or encouraged to be physically fit, and in many cases, actively discouraged. When women first tried to enter the Boston Marathon in 1966, the AAU believed that it was physiologically impossible for women to run that far because it would damage their reproductive organs and cause them to grow hair on their chest. As Bobby Gibb, the first woman to unofficially finish the marathon in 1966, would later say bluntly, they were afraid our uterus would fall out. By the way, she finished in a respectable 3 hours, 21 minutes, wearing a bathing suit, her brother's Bermuda shorts, and boys' running shoes, because they really didn't make them for women back then. Thanks to Title IX, which I mentioned earlier, women's sports programs took a huge leap forward, and with it, women's physical fitness and access to competitive sports programs. This year, in fact, marks the 50th anniversary of Title IX. To test our strength, the 6 of us were put through a number of test flights in several different aircraft, simulating various emergency situations, such as engine, hydraulic, flight control, and electrical failures. Since I had no flight experience, the only one of the 6 of us who didn't, I thought that all aircraft had very stiff, heavy flight controls. Weeks later in my training, I discovered what a wonderful difference functioning hydraulic-assisted flight controls could make. Our physical fitness training consisted of a timed 1.5-mile run, a timed obstacle course, both in deep sand, pull-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, swimming in a pool and Pensacola Bay, and survival training both on land and in water. I discovered a few years ago that I was the only woman of the first 6 to meet all the men's standards for physical training, thanks to my years of riding horses, loading hay, and yes, shoveling manure. This publicity photo shows Barb and Judy wearing their uniform skirts and heels and standing in the sand in front of the obstacle course climbing walls, and probably wondering if the Navy was even thinking about appropriate physical fitness gear for women pilots. The swimming tests were also difficult. There was a 1-mile swim, jumping off of a 15-foot tower, treading water for an hour, an open ocean swim, a parachute drag, a slide for life, and a rope ladder climb, all done in flight suits, boots, and helmets. One of the swimming requirements was known as the Dilbert Dunker. It was designed to train pilots to survive a crash on the water by getting out of their aircraft after it was underwater and upside down. And here it is, underwater and upside down. I had some trouble with the dunker. My parachute harness was too big for me, and it became wedged in the canopy bar when I tried to escape. The rescue swimmer had to kick me free, and I got the dreaded thumbs down and had to repeat the whole thing. My flight training started with primary training in the T-34 in Pensacola, and then on to basic training, which included aerobatics, instruments, and formation flying in the T-28 at nearby Whiting Field. And after that, all pilots were selected for their pipeline, jet, multi-engine, or helicopter. The Navy's plan was to put 3 women in props and 3 women in helicopters. We were not allowed in jets because of the federal statutes in place at the time that prohibited women flying in combat aircraft, and all jets were considered combat. I really had no preference and thought helo sounded like a lot of fun. But my friend Rosemary had no intention of letting the Navy assign her to helicopters. She was the first woman to get a bachelor's degree in aviation technology from Purdue University, and her sights were set on jets. She lobbied hard and persuaded the Navy to put her into props. And she did eventually fly tactical jets. And later, she was the first woman to command an operational aviation squadron. So that meant that just 2 of us ended up in helicopters. I have several enduring memories of my flight training. One was my second primary training flight in the T-34. The first flight in the T-34 is just a familiarization flight, and the instructor does most of the flying. But on the second flight, the student handles the flight controls almost exclusively. And I think it was that point that I truly realized what I'd gotten myself into. Of course, you study your procedures all along the way and try to make this perfect because your instructor pilot, of course, is grading you every step of the way. So we got into the aircraft, and went speeding down the runway. I had my hands on the throttle and the stick and rotated the aircraft. The wheels lifted off the ground, and I absolutely froze. I could not think of what was supposed to come next. All I could think of was, oh my goodness, I'm flying an aircraft. I can't believe this. I had my death grip on the stick and my death grip on the throttle, and I wasn't about to let go of either one. So I'm kind of knowing that I'm forgetting something and waiting for the instructor pilot to prompt me in the back. Finally, he sort of pipes up and says, "So, where are you from?" I said, "California." And he goes, "So, what do they raise in California?" I'm wondering where this is going. So I'm thinking, well, we raise a lot of crops, fruits, nuts, vegetables, everything. And he goes, do they ever raise the landing gear in California? I'd forgotten to raise the landing gear. So I forced myself to let go of the throttle, quickly raised the landing gear, and went back to my death grip, thinking, I know there's more. I have forgotten something else. Finally, he pipes up again. "So what do you suppose the winds are up here?" I said, "Well, they were 250 at 20 when we left the field." He goes, "Well, we're a long ways from the field by now. What do you think they are here?" And I said, "Honestly, I have no idea." He goes, "Well, why don't you stick your hand out the window and see?" I'd also forgotten to close the canopy. So I finally closed the canopy, and things started to come back to me, and the rest of the flight proceeded rather uneventfully. But I'm sure that instructor pilot talks about that flight to this day, where he got to use every line that he'd ever practiced on a student. One of my other memories was the day that I had to fly 3 45-minute training hops back to back in the T-28 without landing. My flight was delayed quite a bit, and I consumed one too many glasses of iced tea. There's a fine line in the Florida heat between remaining hydrated and having to use the restroom. And just as depicted in the movie Hidden Figures, the nearest women's restroom was 2 buildings away from the ready room. And that was the last place you wanted to be when your instructor pilot showed up for your hop. After more than 1.5 hours in the air and 45 minutes to go, I desperately needed the bathroom. The T-28 had a relief tube for pilots to use while flying. And I'll leave that to your imagination, but it's a funnel connected to a tube that vents to the outside of the aircraft. I was so desperate I thought I'd try, but the relief tube was stuck under the seat and would not reach up far enough for me even to attempt to use. Wanting to do the right thing for my fellow male pilots, I wrote up the discrepancy after the flight. Relief tube too short. The maintenance sign-off the next day was, "Pilot has wrong equipment." In the end, I survived it all, and since the Navy was anxious to get us out of training and into the real Navy, I finished the 13-month program in only 10 months. I received my Wings of Gold in April of 1974 as the Navy's 4th woman aviator and the first woman helicopter pilot. I was 4 months short of my 24th birthday. My first duty station was Helicopter Combat Support Squadron 3, HC3, at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, flying the Boeing H-46 Sea Knight helicopter. And this is a photo of the H-46 flying over the San Diego Coronado Bay Bridge. The H-46 is a pretty big helo, almost 46 feet nose to tail, and over 84 feet long, including both rotor arcs. It carried 22 people, or a 3,500-pound external load, and its maximum gross takeoff weight was 22,000 pounds. I was a bit intimidated the first time I saw it, but flying it was really a dream, and I took to it right away. HC3 had a dual mission: to train pilots and aircrew transitioning to the 46, and to deploy vertical replenishment detachments aboard supply ships. A vertical replenishment detachment's primary mission was to transfer passengers, cargo, and mail between 2 ships at sea. And this photo shows an external cargo load being transferred. My reception in the squadron was very good. They already had enlisted women assigned, and some were even in the maintenance department repairing the helos. There was also one other female officer who worked in the administration department. For the most part, my commanding officers and fellow pilots were very supportive. Here I am holding my signature helmet that is now on display at the Air and Space Museum in San Diego's Balboa Park. What was a major problem, as I quickly discovered, was Federal Law 10 U.S. Code Section 6015, which stated that Navy women, quote, may not be assigned to aircraft that are engaged in combat missions, nor may they be assigned to duty on vessels of the Navy other than hospital ships or transports. In 1974, there were no transport ships left in the Navy, and the only hospital ship was on the East Coast and rarely left the dock. The history behind this law was quite interesting. After the experiences of World War II, the military services were committed to maintaining and even expanding the role of servicewomen and putting those changes into law. In the Congressional Record of 1948, the Navy actually proposed allowing women to serve on ships, but Congress would have none of it. In particular, Congressman Carl Vinson, the powerful head of the Armed Services Committee, was vehemently opposed to allowing women to serve on ships or fly aircraft on the grounds that it exposed them to combat. Just fix it so they cannot go to sea at all, he said in congressional testimony. Section 6015 was the resulting law, and the reason I wasn't even allowed to hover over a ship anchored off the San Diego coast, and why the 6 of us were initially not allowed to fly jets because they were all considered combat aircraft. In a karmic bit of historical irony, the nuclear-powered carrier USS Carl Vinson, which bears the congressman's name, was one of the first combatant ships to have a gender-integrated role in a crew in the 80s after 6015 was modified. And additionally, in 2012, the Navy's first all-woman E-2C Hawkeye crew flew a combat mission from the USS Vincent. They were members of Carrier Airborne Early Warning Squadron 125, which was embarked on the carrier. And that flight may have been one of the first unmanned flights from a U.S. carrier. Realizing that 6015 was preventing me from doing the primary mission of my squadron, and that it would severely impact my career, I started looking for ways to change the law. Our squadron hangar happened to be across the street from our wing commander's staff building and just down the road from the Pacific Naval Air Force commander offices, so doing anything under the radar was not an option. In March of 1976, I began by writing a letter requesting shipboard deployment to the Secretary of the Navy via the chain of command. My commanding officer gave it a favorable endorsement and forwarded it to the wing commander. And that was the last I ever heard of it. Clearly, a polite request submitted in accordance with Navy regulations was not going to have any effect. I soon found out that the ACLU had already filed a lawsuit on behalf of 3 Navy enlisted women who were challenging the constitutionality of 6015. A couple of months later, I added my name as a plaintiff to the lawsuit, along with 2 other naval women officers. I was the only aviator among the 6 plaintiffs. I continued flying at HC3 until late 1977 and qualified as helicopter aircraft commander. I flew many special mission operations, and I learned how to vert rep on land, but I was never allowed to land on or deploy aboard a ship. I did finally get to practice shipboard landings during my last 2 months in the squadron. During the discovery process for the lawsuit, the Navy denied that it had ever prohibited women from shipboard landings, which was certainly news to me and my commanding officers. That last-minute shipboard landing qualification proved crucial at my next duty station, Naval Air Station Point Mugu, near Santa Barbara. While in HC3 in San Diego, I was under the close watch of the wing type and fleet commanders. It was a whole different world at Point Mugu. It seemed like no one was watching anything, and the nearest people in the chain of command up the way were nowhere to be found. I was assigned to the operations department as a helo pilot, where our primary missions were search and rescue and weapons test and evaluation support. The latter involved primarily target drone recovery from the Pacific Ocean off of Point Mugu in Southern California. And this is a picture of a target being recovered in that area. Target drone recovery was always a very challenging operation. Targets would sometimes get lost and we had to search for them. Harnesses wouldn't deploy properly for pickup, or the drones would partially sink. On one of my recoveries, the drone harness did not set properly, and the drone began flying back and forth at the end of the pendant under the helo. That's a very dangerous situation, of course, and we had to release it. A few $100,000 worth of drones skipped across the water like a stone on a pond and disintegrated into 1,000 pieces. Search and rescue operations were another potentially risky mission. You never knew when or where you would be called to rescue someone on land or at sea. My first rescue involved a small civilian plane flying to Bakersfield that crashed in a steep, snow-covered canyons in the mountains north of Ventura, killing 2 of the 3 people on board. The lone survivor managed to stay alive on melted snow and insects for about a week before the Civil Air Patrol spotted him in a steep canyon. Our helo was called to rescue the survivor, and once on the scene, we lowered our crewman about 100 feet down to the crash site. But before we could hoist the survivor aboard the helo, he had one request. He had broken both of his wrists in the crash, but had managed to unzip his pants to relieve himself, and now he needed our crewman's help to zip up his pants. In spite of everything he had been through, dignity prevailed. And this is a photo of our crew after we were presented with the rescue citation. In July of 1978, while I was stationed at Point Mugu, Judge John Sirica of Watergate fame from the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., handed down his decision on 6015, declaring it unconstitutional. And that cleared the way for me to be able to officially land aboard ship and deploy. The problem was, at Point Mugu, we never deployed aboard ships. But then fate intervened. A big naval exercise was scheduled off the coast of Southern California, and they needed drone recovery crews and 2 helicopters aboard the USS Vancouver, an amphibious assault ship. Excuse me. I immediately volunteered, and because of my last-minute shipboard landing qualification in HC3, I was one of the few current pilots. In late 1978, I flew aboard for my first shipboard deployment, and the next 6 days became among the most unforgettable of my career, to say the least. On our 4th day at sea, the drones were launched. Our first helo went after the first drone, and I took off in the second helo to get the second drone. We recovered it and returned it to the USS Vancouver, and then launched to await airborne for the next target. Unbeknownst to us, our first helo was having problems recovering their drone, which had partially sunk. We hadn't heard them on the radios for quite a while, so we climbed to try and raise them, or at least to see them visually. It worked, and we spotted them a few miles away, but very low over the water, and that worried us. As we got closer, we saw a huge surge of rotor spray, and I knew instantly that they had landed in the water. We circled helplessly while they tried to take off, with only one of their 2 engines working. We watched as all 3 air crewmen exited out the back of the downed helo. The rotor stopped turning when the remaining engine was shut down, and the helo rolled on its side and began to sink. Finally, to our great relief, the 2 pilots popped out of the cockpit from the starboard emergency exit. We hoisted all 5 crew members into our helo and returned them to the ship. After relaunching to recover several more targets, we were finally finished for the day. As I made my way through the ship to sickbay to check on our rescued crew, I was suddenly stopped by a member of the ship's crew who snapped to attention, gave me a sharp salute, and said, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." Surprised, I asked why. He told me he had been watching our flight operations on the signal bridge when the helo went down. Apparently, there had been some spirited wagering among the crew concerning whether it had been me who crashed the helo. I gathered the odds were not in my favor. In the crewman's words, "We all thought you did it," and that included the captain of the ship. I went on to fly pretty much nonstop during the next 2 days, since the 2 pilots from the downed helo were not allowed to fly until the accident investigation was complete. We recovered many more targets, some within viewing distance of the Vancouver, and I could see the crew lining the rail and taking pictures. At least they weren't betting against me anymore. Even though my 2 years at Point Mugu were very good ones, it was becoming clear to me that while 6015 had been modified to allow for some shipboard duty, opportunities would not be available soon enough for me to make up for the career milestones that I had already missed. My career path and promotion opportunities on active duty did not look promising. So in late 1979, I made the decision to leave active duty and continue my career in the Naval Reserve. For the next 5 years, I was fortunate to fly with HC-9, a Navy Reserve squadron whose primary mission was, ironically, combat search and rescue, flying the H-3 Sikorsky Sea King. Combat SAR is a very demanding mission. I was grateful I never had to use it in an actual combat environment. But the low-level flying in the deserts around Fallon, Nevada was challenging and rewarding and fun. And it was during this tour that I got my 7th and final rescue when we picked up a Marine jet pilot who had ejected from his A4 off the coast of San Diego. Another highlight of my time in HC-9 was an opportunity to land on the USS Bella Wood, the helicopter carrier where my husband Dwayne was assigned as aircraft handler. I'm not sure how many, if any, married couples have been able to do this, especially in 1981, but it was a very special experience. At that time, in fact, we were probably the only U.S. Navy helicopter pilots married to each other. For the remainder of my reserve career, I followed Dwayne's active duty assignments, serving in the Pentagon at the Navy Command Center in the same spaces that were later destroyed on 9/11, and later with the Commander Fleet Air Mediterranean Reserve Unit out of New Orleans and Naples, Italy. Those tours were followed by various assignments in Hawaii, Florida, and finally San Francisco. And I retired as a captain in 1998 after 25 years of service. With the repeal of 6015 in 1993 and the lifting of combat restrictions across all services in 2016, women's opportunities have increased exponentially since the 70s. All the military service academies have been open to women since 1976, and all services, including the Coast Guard, have thousands of women serving in all types of aviation positions as pilots, flight officers, mission specialists, flight surgeons, maintenance technicians, and air crew. Tactical jet communities in the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force all have women aviators who are flying combat missions all over the world. In the Navy, women have commanded battle groups and numbered fleets and have promoted as high as 4-star admiral. 16 of our 58 women astronauts have served in the U.S. military aviation fields. This is a picture of Nicole Mann, astronaut class of 2013, with her son Jack, who was 2 or 3 years old at the time. Nicole completed astronaut training in 2015. She was recently assigned to SpaceX Crew 5, where she will become the first female commander of a NASA commercial crew program launch scheduled for September of this year. She is also selected to be among the first 9 women to be trained to land on the moon as a member of NASA's Artemis team, presently scheduled for 2024. And here is Lieutenant Colonel Nicole Mann, Marine Corps FA-18 Hornet pilot. Nicole is the daughter-in-law of one of my HC-3 squadron mates when I was stationed at NAS North Island, San Diego. Captain John Mann told me that if the first 6 Navy women aviators had not paved the way for other women, his daughter-in-law would not be a Marine lieutenant colonel, a jet fighter pilot, a Navy test pilot, and an astronaut. In August of 2021, Captain Amy Barenschmidt became the first woman to command a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln. Amy started her Navy career as a helicopter pilot at Naval Air Station North Island, the same Naval Air Station where I did my first operational pilot assignment after pilot training. It's taken a long, long time to get to this point, over 48 years. And there were many times the first 6 of us did not think that it would ever happen. Of course, with opportunity comes risks, and we have lost women pilots in aircraft accidents and in combat, including Lieutenant Commander Barbara Rainey, the very first woman to earn her Navy Wings of Gold. She perished in a training accident in 1982, and she's survived by her husband and 2 daughters. In March of 2017, we had the opportunity to honor Lieutenant Commander Rainey along with the rest of our inaugural group of women military aviators when Women in Aviation International held their annual conference in Orlando, Florida, with over 4,500 attendees. Rosemary Mariner, Anna Scott, myself, Jane O'Day, and John Rainey, representing his wife Barbara, and Judy Bruner, were inducted into the WAI Pioneer Hall of Fame. Surprisingly, this picture is the first one to show us all together 44 years after we were selected for pilot training. I was also honored to join Rosemary's family this past weekend when she was inducted a second time into the Pioneer Hall of Fame for her decades-long efforts to ensure equal opportunities for all military women. Not only did Rosie push open the doors, she held them open for everyone who followed. I'd like to conclude my presentation with a final bit of WASP history. When the WASP were disbanded in 1944, all records of their service were classified and sealed for 35 years. Their contributions to the war effort were little known and basically inaccessible to historians. Then, after the Navy opened the flight program to women in 1973, the surviving WASPs began to lobby for recognition of their service. In November of '77, President Carter granted them veteran status with limited benefits. And in 2002, those benefits were expanded to include eligibility for burial at Arlington National Cemetery. But in 2015, the Secretary of the Army tried to rescind that benefit, saying that Arlington was running out of space. I guess he thought that singling out a small group of 90-plus-year-old women wouldn't get much pushback. He didn't count on the surviving WASPs and the family members of those amazing women, and he didn't count on Colonel Martha McSally, U.S. Air Force retired. The decision to exclude the WASPs from Arlington did not sit well with Colonel McSally, the first female U.S. fighter pilot to fly a combat mission over enemy territory following the 1991 lifting of the prohibition on female combat pilots. With over 100 combat hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt bomber, this former Arizona congressman and senator was ready to fight again for the WASPs. In May of 2016, her legislation successfully passed Congress, and the WASPs are now allowed to be laid to rest at Arlington, a fitting honor for the women who paved the way for the future of all women in military aviation. And it might not have happened without a woman military combat pilot to fight for their cause. As I mentioned earlier, when I left active duty in 1979, it was clear to me that I had won the battle by challenging Section 6015, but that I could not win the war. That would be left to those who followed, women who have served and continue serving today. Many firsts have happened since I earned my Navy Wings of Gold in 1974, and there are still many firsts left to achieve. And today there are thousands of women in all the services all over the world doing just that. Sometimes they receive some recognition for those milestones, but more often they take it in stride, knowing that every accomplishment, large or small, is another step forward. And it has been my privilege to have helped pave the way for them. As Lindsay mentioned in our introduction, we are now joined by Beverly Weintraub. If you would like to read more about the first six of us, we are the subject of Bev's newly published book entitled Wings of Gold, the story of the first women naval aviators. Beverly is a Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial writer for the New York Daily News. Wings of Gold was selected as Amazon's Editor's Choice in their Best History category and is available for order from Amazon. Thanks for being here, Bev.
Thanks for having me join you, Joellen, and thanks to Google for hosting this wonderful presentation.
Yes, thank you. As I close, I want to thank my husband, Dwayne, for his incredible support and encouragement to make this presentation possible, and for being my wingman for over 43 years. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today, and it has been a distinct honor to have served our country and all of its citizens like you. Thank you very much. And we're open for questions, and Lindsay, I think, will be moderating those.
Yes, Joellen, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and all the hard work you've done as someone who has literally tried to walk in your steps. I am so humbled by everything that you have accomplished and that you've shared. So first of all, just thank you. I've got just a few questions that I've prepared for you ladies, and then we'll shift into the audience questions. So Joellen, you touch on this lightly in your discussion, but I can only imagine, especially back in that time in the 70s, that you really faced day to day, minute to minute, a lot of hardship with your male peers in the military. And then I may venture to guess some, women maybe either in the military or in the private sector for just maybe being critical or just really unknowing about what you were trying to push forward. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that now, reflecting, with all your years of experience, what that was like and perhaps what you've taken with you through that reflection.
Yes, obviously there was a lot of opposition. Interestingly enough, I think when the first six of us were in, some of that resistance was not as strong as it actually was in later years when there were more women and more senior women. I think one of the most disheartening things about the early years was the women who publicly were working against us. One of them was Phyllis Schlafly. There were just many women who didn't see why this had to happen. They couldn't seem to understand the stepping stone that the military provides in terms of leadership and opportunity, not to mention retirement pay, GI Bill, and other, financial benefits. So I think that was some of the most disheartening part of what we went through. The day-to-day stuff, we just put our heads down and kept going. Like I said, honestly, in the early years, it wasn't as strong as it was, particularly, for instance, around the time that Tailhook occurred in 1991. That was probably the pinnacle or the nadir of of when women were faced the most opposition, I think, and at the highest levels at that time. So yes, that was difficult.
Thank you. Beverly, I would love to hear from you. I haven't read the book yet, but now it is on my list for 2022. I'm curious, when you thought about venturing into book authorship for your first time, what compelled you most about Joellen and her cohort story? Like, what did you most want to highlight?
Well, and it was an interesting thing because the story really found me. I covered aviation, among other issues, as an editorial board member of the New York Daily News. I'm also a pilot. I've had my private certificate for a couple of decades. And one of my colleagues from the Daily News works in the opinion section of the Washington Post. So when something would happen involving women in aviation, I would get an email, do you want to write something? So I've written a few op-eds about women in aviation. And when the when missing man flyover happened over Captain Mariner's funeral, which made national headlines, I was asked to write something, which I did. And then an editor at Lions Press a few months later saw the piece and said, we think this is a fascinating story, would make an interesting book. What do you think? And the more I dug into the personal stories of these 6 pioneering women, the more I was struck by their commitment and their perseverance, and how their personal stories illustrated the changes that were happening in society, the changes that were happening in the military, and how they personally made some of those changes happen for themselves, and particularly for the generations of women to follow.
Thank you, Bev. Totally agreed. And I can't wait to get through the book. Andrew and team, could we maybe take a look at some of the questions we have from the audience? Amazing. Lauren, this question is for Joellen and Beverly. Based on your journey and life experiences, what advice would you give to your younger self if you encountered her today?
I get asked this a lot, and boy, I wish I could go back and talk to my younger self many times. So I think the first thing is, it's obviously I didn't care too much about the mainstream or what people thought women should be doing since I applied for the program. But still, when you get in the military, the chain of command is intimidating, especially for a young ensign who doesn't know anything. And as I mentioned in my talk, one of the things that was just shocking to me was that the Navy said that we couldn't go hover aboard over ships or practice landings or anything. And then in the discovery process, completely denied that had ever happened. And I was just furious about that. Not much I could do about it in retrospect, but I think my takeaway from that is don't accept a no without a lot of documentation. I mean, I just accepted that verbally from my commanding officers, and they accepted verbally from the wing commander and the type commander. So in retrospect, we should have demanded a complete JAG reading on that, and we didn't do it. And in retrospect, I would have gone back and really, really pushed that point. And the other thing is, network and find your mentors. We, of course, didn't have women mentors that were pilots back then. But also it was very difficult for us to keep in touch with one another, long before cell phones, of course, and social media. And we were scattered across the country, and in fact, across the globe. I was in California. A couple women were on the East Coast. Jane was in Rota, Spain, and Judy was flying hurricane hunters down in Florida. So we were spread out quite a bit. We never got to see one another. We didn't get to talk to one another about what each person was experiencing. So I would say, keep in touch with your compatriots and know what they're doing and have those conversations, because you might find out that what you're experiencing is more common than you think it is. So those would be my two big things, I think, that I would go back and do a little differently.
Great advice. What about you, Bev?
I would have started flying much earlier. I fell in love with airplanes when I was 8 years old and told my mother when I was 13 I wanted to learn how to fly, and got that over my dead body look. And that was unfortunately the end of it for a couple of decades. I did get my private, but not until I was an adult with some small children. So definitely would have done that sooner, not taken no for an answer there. And the other thing, just be bolder. It's intimidating for me, particularly to talk to strangers. I was an editor rather than a reporter for a long time because I didn't want to be the person who had to ask the family, how do you feel that your house just burned down? So when this book came along, I need to reach out to people who don't know me. I'm a total stranger, and convince them to let me tell their stories for them. And it was very intimidating. But if I was going to do it, I just had to be bold and do it. And the reception I got could not have been warmer and more helpful. And I'm just honored that this community of military female pilots has taken me in and allowed me to share their stories with the world.
Amazing.
We're very grateful that you have told it and that you chose our story. We couldn't be more grateful.
Awesome. I think we're ready for a next audience question. Great. From Sophia. Joellen and Bev, what was your motivation to get into aviation? What advice do you both have for women that want to take on aviation but don't know how to start?
Well, I'm kind of an anomaly, I guess. I grew up not having any desire to fly particularly, although little incidents in my life sort of, I guess, foretold that I might end up in aviation. One of my early memories is when my father was assigned to Sangley Point, was that a hurricane came through and a squadron of P-2 Neptunes was sort of waylaid and had to hold out at the end of our street. Our street literally dead ended onto the runway. And so, of course, it didn't take us long. I was probably 8 or 9 years old at the time. Didn't take us long to discover these airplanes were down at the end and the crews were with them. And they were so friendly. They let us crawl all over the airplanes, and they even put us in the cockpit one day when they were doing engine run-ups and everything. And I'm sure every one of those guys would be amazed to learn that that little 8 or 10-year-old girl in their cockpit went on to become a Navy pilot. So, of course, I never dreamed about it. And I don't know, always in my life, the whole time I was growing up, I just knew I wanted to do something different. It was a vague feeling, but a very strong feeling. And when this fell in my lap, the opportunity to apply for the program, even though aviation hadn't really been on the list, I decided, this is it. This is a sign. You should go for this. And so I did. And I think one of the other things was that until this person told me that, who handed me the message and told me, no, I said, oh, it's very nice. How nice that they're opening the program to women. And he said, no, you're going to apply for this. And that was the first time it had ever dawned on me that, yes, I'm going to apply for that. And I was very fortunate that I was in the right place at the right time with some of the qualities that they were looking for, and that they saw something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself yet. So that was how I got into it.
Bev?
Well, the first time I flew commercial when I was 8 years old, visiting my grandparents in Florida, and there were these lights and these markings and all these huge metal tubes are taxiing around and they fly. And I wanted to know what it all meant and how it all worked. And I was just intrigued by the entire enterprise. And even though my initial queries about flying were sort of put up the kibosh, it was still really, really something that fascinated me. And a bit later in life, I was handed a gift certificate for my birthday by a friend whose father had gotten his private certificate. And that's how I started in earnest. And a few months into my training, I received a call from a woman named Joanne Campbell, who was a member of this group called the 99s, which is the International Organization of Women Pilots. And did I need help? Did I have questions? Would I like to come to their meeting and meet other women who fly? And it's such a terrific support network. There are many, many small airports that have flight schools. It's a fairly easy way, especially Google it, which airport has a flight school, and check it out and see if it's a comfortable thing. But for women especially, the 99s are in every state and they're international, and it's a tremendous resource. If someone just doesn't know how to start, that's the way to start.
And one thing, we were just at the Women in Aviation Conference this past weekend, and there are many, many scholarships out there that you can apply for. Once you get your foot in the door and start flying and things, they give out scholarships. Multiple organizations give out scholarships for not just for pilots, but for maintenance technicians and almost a number of other aviation-related fields. So it's out there. 99s are a great way to start. Get yourself involved with other women who are involved in aviation.
Great. So lesson learned is Google aviation training, and I bet there's going to be things that you can learn. That's amazing. Team, do we have any other questions coming from the audience? All right, from Kimberly. Joellen, you mentioned that there's still a lot of progress to be made even today. What is the next big change you'd like to see for female aviators? And I may broaden this, Joellen, maybe to females in the military. I've seen a lot of progress in my short career, and you've seen even more. So maybe let's broaden this to women in the military.
There aren't enough women pilots in the military. I mean, you wouldn't know that, but based on the convention that we attended this week, where there were hundreds of women military aviators that attended, but still we're a very, very small percentage of pilots in the military. I would really like to see that percentage increase dramatically. But I think women just don't consider it as an option. And it needs to be out there more, and women need to think about that more. So I guess that's my main thing, is I would love to see a lot more women pilots out there, a lot more applicants for the program, and more women in the other aviation areas too. Air traffic controllers, schedulers, air crew, and maintainers. There's a lot of good jobs maintaining aircraft, and the military is a way to get your foot in the door on that.
Great. Well, I hope that this talk is a good, inspiring launch pad for any women that may be considering it. So with that, I'll kind of wrap. But Joellen and Bev, thank you so very much for your time, for everything that you've put into this story, and to both of your careers. We are so honored to have you with us today. Thank you for the time and attention, and we just really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.